and welcome. This is Face the Nation. I'm Sonali Panikapabige. What an interesting few weeks it has been, and how theatrical. Now, whilst acknowledging the tragicomic aspects of the weeks gone by, tonight on Face the Nation, we decided to go beyond the critiquing of the situation as it is and try to take stock of the situation and look at ways in which we can resuscitate the economy. And to this end, we have invited as guests on our show 3 academics. They are all from the University of Colombo. Very quickly, let me introduce them to you. Professor Siri Hettige, Emeritus Professor, University of Colombo, joins us. He's a regular guest on our show. Thank you, sir, for joining us tonight. We are also joined by Professor H.D. Karunaratne. He's the former Dean of the Faculty of Management and Finance at the University of Colombo. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening.
And finally, our guest tonight, Dr. Priyanga Dunusingha, Senior Lecturer at the University of Colombo. Thank you for joining us tonight, Doctor. Now, my first question is to Professor Siri Hettige. Professor, quite recently, Lonely Planet rated Sri Lanka as the #1 travel destination for 2019. However, now the situation that we're hearing of is quite different. In your opinion, how must Sri Lanka now brace itself? Tourism and agencies speak of very negative figures overall. How do we go beyond this? How do we resuscitate tourism? Because this is one of Sri Lanka's major ways of earning revenue.
Yes, certainly tourism has been a major contributor to our export earnings, or at least the earnings of foreign exchange. And given the fact that our trade gap is quite wide, we depend on a very few sources of foreign exchange to really address the issue of the trade gap. I think we can't afford to really have a situation where we have a major decline in tourist earnings in the country. I remember the last figure that I came across was something like 3.6 billion US dollars. But of course, compared to what we get from the remittances, it is less than half. I think remittances are now around just over 7 billion US dollars. So what I'm feeling is that that we just can't afford to have a major disruption of the external economic relations that we have developed over the years, mainly because we are not in a situation where we can afford to have greater vulnerability. We have been vulnerable all these years, but I think we can't have more vulnerability, and certainly any major disruption in this area.
Speaking of vulnerability, there's a massive dependence on imports. I mean, even if you take, for example, life-saving drugs or fuel, for that matter.
Yeah,
the entire transport system in Sri Lanka can collapse if there is some issue with regard to fuel. No, and we have seen something close to it in the past.
I think the main problem, as I can see, is that we don't have much space to really manage both exports as well as imports. For instance, you can't increase exports at will. You have to really build up your capacity to produce export commodities. That you cannot do all of a sudden. So we don't have really much space there. And then of course, as you rightly mentioned, as far as imports are concerned, we don't have really much of a choice. For instance, if you take the major imports, I mean, the intermediate goods are so critical for us to keep our industries going. And then if you take the entire service sector is so dependent on imports. And then of course, as you rightly mentioned, in the area of the consumption, I mean, we are not only talking about food, but we are also talking about medicine, and the entire transport sector, I think, is dependent, not only, in terms of fuel needs, but also in terms of the entire transport system dependent on imports. So I think, I think the issue here is that we are already vulnerable and we can't afford to be more vulnerable.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Hettige, for your thoughts. My next question is to Professor H.D. Karunaratne, former Dean of the Faculty of Management and Finance. Let's talk a bit about the policy instability in Sri Lanka at present. We keep seeing this over and over again. This directly impacts investor confidence. There is very little investor confidence in Sri Lanka at present, with international investors, for example, holding back on coming into Sri Lanka, bringing in investments, as a result of which the country is again suffering. How do you view this, and how is Sri Lanka to move beyond this and get back on track?
Yes, Sonali, it is very interesting area where we need to concern about the foreign investment, because basically there is a problem in Sri Lanka. The local, in the domestic side, there is a gap between savings and investment. So even the private sector savings are less than the investment, and then there is government sector also. We know expenses are very big than the income, the revenue. So that the only kick we can get in for the Sri Lankan economy is we need to get huge foreign investment. But the problem is foreign investment has been dream for Sri Lanka for about 30 years. People thought that because of the war. But after even war, people expect to receive the foreign investment, but we haven't got as we expected. And in particularly in 2015, that the new government expected to get 45 billion foreign investment for megapolis projects, but it was not came. So now the important thing we need to understand how we go beyond this point. And there are short-term indices as well as long-term indices. At this situation, I think we have to focus domestic policies rather than going into foreign investment, because we know the foreign investment is essential, but we need long-term supply side policies to promote the foreign investments. Policy instability is a well-known thing for Sri Lankan policies, because last 3 years, the time to time, even three budgets were contradictory, and there were many policies. So I think the main problem in Sri Lanka, preparation of policies are based on whether actual facts or not is a question. I think in Sri Lanka at grassroots level, we do not have information correctly reporting to the ground level. Sure. Because we see that the Grama Sevaka level, still we are depending on a Grama Sevaka certificate to get the people's notification. What I always propose that there should be a computerized unit at the Grama Sevaka level to get the more information.
So Professor, these are very basic things.
Yes,
so if these aren't being done,
yes.
I mean, the country is in a huge crisis, right?
That's what. We are formulating policies as we wish, but not based on facts. The realities in the country, and what we need, what are the resources we have at grassroots level, we need to identify. Without identifying those resources, we expect that foreigners to come here and do investment. But foreigners asking why we should come to Sri Lanka. Do we have enough trained skilled labor in Sri Lanka? That there are a lot of examples we can give that where the foreign investors are going, where there is skilled labor, there are enough resources, low cost things. But when it comes to Sri Lanka, no even at least information. So the starting point, I think, to Sri Lankan economy, we need to collect correct information. And the very pathetic thing what we had is, from the independence, we could not identify who is poor, who is really poor. Because of that, we have been wasting a lot of resources in vain rather than for real need people.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. We hope to continue the conversation on those lines, Professor. I move my attention now to Dr. Priyanka Dunusingha, Senior Lecturer at the University of Colombo. Dr. Dunusingha, we can't ignore the political instability that is currently in issue these days. since that has been the sort of center point of all the other crises. Do you believe that academics, civil society, intellectuals, other groups can sort of join forces and do something productively despite or regardless of the political crisis that is currently in existence? How do you see these factors sort of playing together? Because clearly we have a political crisis at hand, and we're not certain as to whether this will continue for a long period of time or a short period of time. But on the other hand, we have all these other players like the civil society, like the academics, like people who want to get involved in taking the country forward. How do these equations work hand in hand is my question to you. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a strange question.
As I understood that, I think it is very clear that we at this moment face a severe political instability which has impacted on not just the economic but also the other dimensions of the society. So as a result of that, we have come to a situation where to some extent we do not know who govern the country, who really make decisions with respect to key economic policies. So because of that, we certainly agree that we need to have a political stability, in particular in a situations where the economy is facing a severe crisis. Partly the crisis we see in our external front with respect to rupee depreciation and the balance of payment. On the other hand, we could see that the economy in the domestic economy also face a number of issues. Now, I do not know to what extent civil society and the academia could really intervene into this situation and help in solving this situation, because one way or the other the civil society as well as the academia support either the party, and also the space for the civil society and the academia at this moment is very limited. In solving the present crisis.
Sure.
Because of that, I really need the two major political parties to understand the situation, the present economic crisis, and come to a certain settlement. Because if they do not reach a settlement, at the end of the day, it is not the UNP or the SLFP, but the people of this country suffer. So we see the rupee keep depreciating, we see the external debt stock keep rising, we see that Sri Lanka is being downgraded, and all of these will accumulate and the people pay severe economic burden in next 1 to 2 years. So because of that, I think the political leaders should understand the situation without passing it to the previous or this government or the previous government. They must act, and I think if not, we will see a real economic crisis in coming
Certainly,
first to second year. Yeah.
Wishful thinking, and of course the need of the hour. Now, recently the Daily FT reported Mr. Bandula Gunawardena as saying that they have plans to stabilize the exchange rate at 160 rupees to the dollar. Is this feasible?
I don't think so. I don't think in the sense 160. The reason is that we know why the rupee keep depreciating. Partly it is because of the US dollar getting strengthened, and on the other hand, we have limited space, policy space in countering this situation. We have the reserve. If you look at the reserve position of the central bank, the reserve position is not sufficient in order to face the situation, because we have to keep the reserve in order to pay the debt. That the average debt payment per year is around 4 billion per year. In that context, and on the other hand, as the Professor Hettige mentioned, we are an import-dependent country, so that we have a limit, or we have certain constraint in limiting imports. Also, in a short term, we cannot expand our exports. Given these situations, I don't think that we have policy space, and the government could actively intervene into the situation and fix it at a particular rate. Rather, certainly if the politicians and the policymakers are concerned about the situation, they could certainly slow down the rate of depreciation. I think that is what we need right now, rather than fixing it at a particular rate.
Right.
That is impossible.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Very quickly, before opening the floor for questions from our journalists tonight, a quick question to Professor Siri Hettige. Now, since the legislative sovereignty of the people vests in the 225 parliaments that we, the people, have elected into power or service, really, can't we make a suggestion that parliamentarians regularly, mandatorily have to attend lectures on important topics like policy, on transitional justice, Professor, matters that they need to make policy on? Can't we make it mandatory for them?
Well, I think
or also very, discipline.
No, I think this is this is a very critical issue. Actually, when you look at the administration of a country, certainly people who are responsible for administering whatever they administer, they have to be guided by something, and that is basically, in the modern world, we say knowledge. You can also call it something else, like you have to face the facts. You have to be guided by facts. Now, I think you have to understand the situation in terms of what it is, in terms of facts, and then only you can figure out how you could really change that situation for the better. Now, I think we have a big issue, because we know not only at this level, national level, but also at other levels, we don't see this kind of knowledge-driven decision making. Take, for instance, even a local council. I mean, a local council, as you know, can do a great deal to alleviate the problems that the ordinary people face. Not only, small problems, but also bigger issues like massive, public health challenges.
Yeah.
But the point is that we have no way of having that kind of people controlling the local councils in this country for various reasons. Because, we have not really instilled in the minds of people in this country that they have to elect people who are competent, capable, knowledgeable to address the issues that they are confronting. Because, the ordinary people can't manage these issues. That is why we elect, governments, and that we expect the governments to basically address these issues in terms of applying knowledge. Now, for instance, for instance, the structure of the economy. People should know what is the structure of this economy. And we know that the structure of the economy has been changing over the last 40 years, 50 years. Now, now the present structure of the economy is such that, as I already mentioned, we are very, very vulnerable, because we are dependent on imports, and we cannot do very much about imports. And the same with, exports. We cannot do very much about exports in the short run. In the short run, but of course in the long run, certainly. So that is where national planning comes in. You know, in this country, we had a National Planning Council, you know, and then this National Planning Council was abolished in the late 70s. And up to now, we don't have a national level forum where the knowledgeable people will sit around the table and come up with policy options. You know, study the structure and come up with policy options so that these policy options can be presented to the decision makers. So, but you know, this process has not happened in this country for years. So, what I'm getting at is that, you know, it is very critical that people who are supposed to take decisions know what they are doing. For instance, legislation. What is the main function of the? There are several functions. What are these major functions of the, let's say, Parliament? I mean, I can point to one or two. Certainly, legislative function. You know, they have to come up with the best legislation to deal with the issues that we confront in the country. It may be environmental laws, it may be, you know, financial regulation, it may be, you know, building regulations, you know, it may be anything. Now, regulatory function. Now, for you to be able to come up with, you know, legislation to really regulate public affairs in the country, you have to have people who are knowledgeable. Now, of course, you know, other functions like, for instance, the financial control of the public finances, you know, is in the hands of the legislators, you know, in the parliament. Now, again, you should know what you are talking about, what you are, you know, say, for instance, these are issues that are being discussed and debated in parliament. And every one of these people should be able to understand the issues and contribute to the discussion and debate, and then to really take an informed decision as to, you know, how to vote for a particular piece of legislation or not. And then, of course, the whole issue of government policies. Now, policies are very complex, and policy making is a very complex process. And the policy making process today is driven by knowledge, not just in Sri Lanka, across the world. Countries that come up with best policies manage well. Countries that neglect the whole policy process go down the drain. Unfortunately, what has happened in Sri Lanka is that we have been going down and down because we have not really paid attention to policy making. Policy making. Now, of course, you have to have specialists to contribute to policy making process, and as I already mentioned, we just don't have the mechanism to get the best minds to contribute to policy analysis. And now these are all weaknesses that we have within the system. Now, of course, we have an extraordinary situation in the country. Even under normal circumstances, we don't have a well-functioning machinery, state machinery. I mean, we have a suboptimal, you know, state apparatus in this country, and it has been so for a long time.
On that note, I'd like to open the floor for questions from Nadeem Majid and Deshan Gonawala. Deshan, let's start off with you.
Thank you, Sonali. I want to direct my question to Professor Karunaratne. Now, from 1948, essentially, we have been heavily dependent on the state. You know, it's something that's been ingrained in our people. Do you think that practically, given the situation now, even moving forward, that we can see a shift towards a more self-sustaining, towards a more different policy approach moving forward?
Yes, of course, because we know when it comes to 1948 that Sri Lanka was a very much developing country. The mass scale poverty was there, about 60% people were below poverty line. But now I think the world has become, as Professor Ettige also pointed out, world is now a strategic world. So we need to have kind of a strategic answers for that. Because state means not only even this legislature and all others, there should be good institutions. That institutions, like for example in Japan, there is economic policy making agency. So that is economic policy planning agency. So we need to focus strategically by getting the data, the correct data for correct policy making, and addressing the policies by going in the strategic approaches. Because time to time we know the policies have changed in Sri Lanka, but those are only macro policies, not the going into grassroots level. We have never asked what really people need. Always Sri Lanka has been following the top-down approach, where a couple of people decide the policies and try to implement, but the grassroots level, what is happening is no one knows.
Professor Karunaratne, what's the reason for that? What's the reason for that top-down approach? It has been there throughout successive governments, whether they have been SLFP governments or UNP governments. It has always been that. Even during even when the economy was closed off, there was more isolationism under Madam Sirimawa Bandaranaike, and then when President Jayawardena introduced the open economy, and even right up to the present, it's always top-down. Right up to, let's say, probably the most recent tax break that was given by President Mahinda Rajapaksa to the agricultural sector. It's always top down. From the beginning, it has been that. Even in the Mahaweli project was top down. What's the reason for that? Why have successive governments not really thought about going to the people and asking them what it is, what are the problems that they are facing? How is it that they can be resolved? What are the policies that they need?
Yes, the problem is that the policy making was not based on the scientific way, where the grassroots level information, using those information, we haven't focused what are the resources we had. For example, assume now Sri Lanka is saying that we have good location. Now this locational advantage we realized very recently. And even we had open economic policies. When we introduced in 1978 these open economic policies, we could not understand what is our objective. What is our objective? That if we are in an open economy, that we need to increase exports. Export is the ultimate objective in an open economy. But beyond that, we went into increasing more social welfare. So increasing social welfare, I think because of the democracy, 5-star democracy what we had. Each successive government expecting how they win in next time. So how they win in next time. So as a result, they give more subsidies, even that these subsidies are not going to necessary places. So without the grassroots data, that they provide these subsidies. So instead of that, we should go for the export.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Dunusinghe, Professor Karunaratne was just saying that, we give these subsidies and these tax exemptions and these tax breaks, and they don't really go to the necessary places. I'd like to focus on the most recent tax break that was given by the Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa to the agricultural sector. Now, there's an accusation that this tax exemption doesn't really benefit local farmers, because the majority of local farmers don't even fall into the income tax bracket, and that this really benefits a handful of corporates and big plantation companies and rice mill owners.
Yes, I think to answer your questions, I think I would like to add something to the previous questions as well. Now, we need to keep that in mind, the political economy of policy making. So why we have a larger state sector partly explain the political economy of keeping a say with the government when it comes to the economic life of ordinary people. So government wants to, one way or the other, have a impact on ordinary person's life, because in that way the government could get the political support, so that in that way government keeps certain programs, certain activities, and those are funded by the resources. So in that way actually the government make people to depend on government. It is true that the people also ask certain things from the government. At the same time, politician wants to have their pet projects in order to keep the people with them, so that they could maximize what we call the vote maximization from that perspective. Coming back to your questions, I think if you look at the recent tax concessions given, certainly according to my understanding, those are unsustainable measures. Why I say so is that we know that the government revenue as a percentage of GDP remains somewhere around 14 to 15%. it was around 11% in 2014. And when you compare with the other developing countries, generally the government revenue is around 18 to 20% of GDP. Why we have to borrow a large sum of money both from the domestic sources as well as the foreign sources? The reason is the budget deficit. That is the difference between the government expenditure and the government revenue is quite large. So in that context, I mean, rather than implementing some financial discipline and increasing the government revenue, if you try to give certain tax concession at this moment, it means that we have to again borrow money to fill the budget gap. And I mean, when you give concession to agriculture, the broader term agriculture, it looks that we cater to the poor ordinary people. That is a kind of a
But that's not the reality.
That is not the reality. That is kind of a slogan that you could put forward. We have given concession to agriculture, but the reality is that concession, nobody estimated the impact of that.
Dr. Dulcinga, again, this goes back to that whole thing of policy being made or decisions being made simply for the reason of political expediency. As you mentioned, in the latest round of tax concessions that have been given as well, it's really more about the optics than any actual thinking behind who this is going to benefit and how it's going to work. You said that these decisions have been very unsustainable. Now, going forward from beyond here, now there are two sides that are calling for, well, both sides basically are now saying, let's have an election, but they're both adamant that they want to be in government when said election happens. What do you take away from that?
I think it's very clear that we have experienced that throughout our history, the budget has been used as kind of an instrument to provide various concessions to people, unsustainable short-term handouts, and winning their votes. That is a strategy that is played out throughout the history. So now, in this context, the both party actually wish to have that weapon, and they know that they could make a huge impact on the electoral system and winning the people. So that actually, if not this change happen, I am quite sure that the UNP government would have given some concession through the budget.
Professor Hettige, I believe you were also a part of this committee. There was that was appointed by the President, functioning under the Presidential Secretariat, the National Sustainability Vision Committee that was headed by Professor Mohan Munasinghe, if I'm not mistaken. There was a launch event to submit the report. That report, covering multiple sectors, was submitted. There was a discourse that was launched following that. That has also made some level of progress. There were consultations that were happening along that. What is the future of that kind of those kinds of measures? First of all, I want to ask you whether there was anything productive that came out of that exercise, and going forward, what do you think should be done with things like that?
Well, I think we are talking here about a long-term vision for the country. Where are we today and where do we want to go? How do we get there? Now, it's a kind of a long-term perspective on not only the economy but also on society, the environment, and so on, so that we can really figure out how we could guide the process of development in order to not only reach economic goals but also to balance economic goals with social consideration as well as environmental. I think that is really the wisdom that has really guided a lot of the global level discussions on development over the last several years. Now in 2015, the whole world converged on one thing, that is the way that we have been pursuing development cannot be continued without very serious adverse consequences, right? So that was the decision. So that is why almost the entire world came together and basically argued that we have to adopt SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, there are two other agreements that the world leaders reached, one on climate change and the other one is on disasters. Disasters are becoming more and more intense, and therefore it is absolutely necessary that we have to reduce disasters rather than mop up what happened after a disaster in terms of providing relief and that kind. So
in
the point
Sri Lanka, with this committee that was appointed,
that's the point. Now that's exactly. Now we actually took that message very seriously. I mean, coming from the global community. It's not just from one country, or it's from the the entire world. Basically, you have 165 countries, 180 countries, and so on signing. So naturally, we are also signatories to all three. We, as a country, not as a political party or anything like that. The country has signed these three documents. Now we actually took that message very seriously when we were appointed to this expert committee headed by Professor Munasinghe, and we did our job. Actually, we have put together a fairly comprehensive document that provide the necessary analysis of what is the situation today in this country and how to really bring about change in order to get where we want to go by 2030. Now the question, of course, is long term. Now we know that today we have an extraordinary situation where we can't even have 5 years, let alone 30 years. We can't even have 5 years, because now normally in Sri Lanka governments are elected for 5 years or 6 years, depending. Now it is 5 years. Okay, let's assume 5 years. Now the point is 5 years is a very short period. I can tell you, to bring about any structural change, it is a very short period. That is why changes have always taken place over a longer period. Like for instance, we talk about East Asia. In East Asia, certainly the progress has been phenomenal. I mean, if you take China, if you take Korea, Singapore, and all these countries, I mean, they have managed their economies. I mean, they have managed the economies, and they have been able to really achieve very significant goals in terms of economic development and also social benefits coming out of economic development. Now the point is, it has not been achieved within 5 years, it has been achieved within...
Professor Hettiga, but there is some semblance of policy consistency and stability that has allowed them to do that, which we don't have here. But here in Sri Lanka's case, we're in a situation where decisions have to be made in the short term for the long term.
No, but I think
now with the specific question that I have with regard to this report of the Mohan Munasinghe Committee, the Sustainable Sri Lanka Vision 2030 document that has been given, the discourse that has been followed, when you look at the amount of money that has been spent on the exercise to date, and then you also consider the fact that I recall in 2015 you put forward a proposal for scientifically selecting a cabinet of ministers, a very small cabinet, and then we saw how following that the then administration, which is still sort of the same administration, I suppose. It's a bit of a Acharu situation, but we've seen the scientific method that they have applied in appointing cabinets since then. When you see that when even a simple sort of recommendation of that sort is not being followed, are you confident that something as grand, the grand sort of change that is being proposed through the Sustainable Sri Lanka report will actually come to fruition?
Well, I think this question has to be put to the people in this country because we are talking about their future. You know, it's not the future of the political elite that we are talking about. You know, if the children of this country want to have a decent life in the next 10 years, 20 years, or whatever, if they want to have a secure environment in terms of environmental catastrophes and so on and so forth, if they want to live in a just society where equity, you know, is an accepted norm and so on, where people have equal access to, you know, resources, equal access to opportunities. I mean, this is really a question that we have to put to the people. And the people have to decide for their children, not for themselves. Actually, we have to decide for now the question, of course, is if you do not have this kind of a perspective, and if you do not really manage your economy, society and the environment in the way that we have outlined there, you are basically saying that your children have no future. Is that what our children, is that what the parents want? Parents have to ask the question whether they want to ensure that their children are going to have a secure future, have a, you know, decent life, and so on and so forth. So I think, you know, it's not a question that we have to put to the political elites, because the political elites have responded in the way that they have done. Now, I think the point is, it's true that we have a 5-year, window, 5-year window. Now, the point is, because you have only 5 years, you have to have what we call national consensus on critical policy issues, policy matters. You know, national consensus. Now, the question is, now this would have been put to the political leaders, you know, across the political divide, and they would have accepted that unanimously, because we are not talking about a particular government, we are not talking about a particular political group, we are talking about the future of the young children in this country. So the point is that the voters in this country should be put to the test. I mean, they should ask the question whether the governments that they elect would like to pursue a long-term development strategy that would address all these issues that are really real in the present day, and to ensure that their children will have a better future. Now, so there's a negotiation between the politicians on the one hand and the citizens on the other hand. That citizens would negotiate with the political elite in order to create a better life for their children. Now, I think so it is not a question of whether we want to push this or whether, you know, whether anybody else. So I think that, you know, the voters should ask the question, what do they want the governments to do, irrespective of who is in power, in order to make sure that their children have a better future, their children have a secure future, that they are going to live in a society free of violence, they are going to live in a society where there is justice. I think these are the questions that we have to put to. So it's not a question of putting this to the elite, but so that is why it is necessary to have a bipartisan approach to dealing with long-term problems in a society. Now, say the structure of this economy can go on like this. There's absolutely no way that we could continue with the present structure of the economy. You know,
Thank you very much, Professor Hettige. On that note, we go in for a short commercial break. We're discussing ways in which this economy is to be resuscitated. We'll be back after this short commercial break. Stay with Face the Nation. Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We've seen weeks of bickering across political fora. Let's just try to take a step back and try to collate our information, collate our knowledge, and see how we can try and fix this economy. So to that end, we'd like to continue the conversation with our three academics. My first question is to Professor Siri Hettige once again. Professor, just like in society, we find that, for example, there's a lot of sexually frustrated people in countries where there is no proper comprehensive sexuality education. Similarly, what do you attribute a bunch of shameless, unconscionable, power-greedy policymakers? I mean, why do they exist Is it because we don't call for a minimum set of educational qualifications? Is it because our education system is flawed? What exactly is the problem? Can't we just nip it in the bud? I mean, even now.
Well, I want to take you back to 1916 when John Dewey, he was an educational philosopher, American educational philosopher. He published a seminal book, Democracy and Education.
Okay.
Democracy and Education. You know, his main argument was that education is critical for democracy.
Right.
You know, the role of education is to create an enlightened public, enlightened citizenship. You know, if people are not really given the orientation that is required for them to play a critical role in making their societies better, you know, that society is not going to really prosper. In the sense that in this country, we have really not used education for that purpose at all. I think, you know, our education system has been guided by instrumental values for a long time. What do I mean by instrumental values? Basically, education as a means to an end. It is not a means in itself. For instance, what do we want from education? We want to get qualifications, maybe a university degree, maybe even a PhD, and then we want to get jobs, and with the jobs we want to have a certain standard of living. We want to build a house, buy a car, and so on and so forth. Now that is what education has been by and large about in this country, and that is where the failure has set in. And I think that's a result. We don't really have a populace in this country which can really elect people who will take care of their future and the future of their own children. I think that is where we have, and you know, for instance, we have to make use of public funds allocated to public institutions to benefit the wider public. But what is happening today? We know that public money allocated to public institutions are not being used to benefit the wider public. Take, for instance, a local council. I mean, do the local councils really provide all the necessary services that the ordinary people need to lead a decent life? I mean, do the local councils clean up the environment? Do the local councils, you know, create conditions where the people have access to, you know, basic facilities and so on and so forth? I mean, so point is that it is this problem that we are facing, and that is why you have people electing the kind of people that you just mentioned.
Right.
So I don't think that you can blame the people who have been elected for behaving in the way that they do. I think you have to basically blame the people who elect these people to Parliament and to other various institutions.
So are you saying that the people we elect are a mirror image of ourselves?
Absolutely. That's absolute no question about it. And I think all these people that we are talking about, leaders, you know, and you know, and their followers, and the people who have been, you know, nominated by political parties to various bodies, elected bodies and so on, all these things happen because people are guided essentially by instrumental values. I mean, the point is, now you take, for instance, why do you want to hold public office today? Why do you want to be a minister? Why do you want to be, you know, let's say Pradesh Sabha chairman? Why do you want to be this, that and the other? I think this is the whole problem. Why do you want to be the head of a government institution, for instance? Why do you want to be the chairman of the People's Bank? Why do you want to? I mean, why do you want to be the chairman of the insurance corporation? Why do you want to be chairman of this, that and the other? Now, the problem is, you know, I mean, the point is that those institutions, if you go through the mandates, if you go through their statutes, now say I'm a member of the police commission, and we always have on our table the statute that guides the functioning of the commission. Every day when we have our meetings, we have it on our table, because we always check, you know, the clauses, and we always discuss every day when we meet. You know, we would never discuss anything without really consulting the basic statute. Now the point is, now if you take, for instance, the Pradesh Sabha Act. Pradesh Sabha Act should be read by everyone who is connected with Pradesh Sabha.
Yeah, absolutely.
Similarly, all the legislation that govern policy making, bringing out, various legislation and so. I mean, those should be, people should not be walking empty-handed. They should be carrying, all these documents with them, as we do when we walk into an office. I mean, we would not go to, a lecture in the university without, our notes, without having our reference books and so on. I mean, all three are academics, and, that is what we have been, we got used to. I think this basic practice has to be instilled in the minds of the people. I think the problem is that our education system has done everything other than what it should do to create a better society. I think that is where we have failed, and I think, we have had I have written so much, I have published books on education, but the fact of the matter is that, people really do not want to bring about any major change. Now, I mean, I can talk, days on education. I mean, in any other country, we have primary schools and secondary schools, but how many types of schools that we have in this country? At least 15 types of schools we have in this country. Can you believe this? But that is what it is. But we have a National Education Commission, and National Education Commission is supposed to guide the decision-making process. But is that happening? No. That's the whole problem. So the point is that we have the state machinery, the parliament, all the ministries and so on and so forth, and then we have the public institutions, we have provincial councils, we have local councils, we have everything. And we maintain, 1.5 million people. 1.5 million people. Everything is paid for by the people. But the question, of course, is whether the people get these institutions to deliver. People, tell the people whom they elect that please attend to your job. That is what I'm sending you for. But that negotiation, that conversation doesn't happen here. People just go out and blindly vote, and I think one of these people had received over 100,000 votes. So I mean, this is the situation. So I think we have a long way to go. I think we have a lot to do. I think this is an opportunity for us to reflect on what has been going wrong in this country over a long period of time, and figure out how to rectify some of these things. I think we have to address these issues. I mean, like education is one of the most critical areas.
Thank
I
you,
think
Professor.
unless and until we address this issue, we won't be able to really bring about the necessary change.
Absolutely.
And, yeah.
Thank you very much. I move my attention now to Professor H.D. Karu, former Dean of the Faculty of Management and Finance at the University of Colombo. I'd actually like to pose two questions to you, Professor. The first is now, strengthening systems as opposed to strengthening individuals is something that Sri Lanka hasn't really caught on to. Yes. So it's always about who you know. It's always about, the culture of paying bribes. It's sort of inherent almost and accepted almost. Although there are, institutions such as the Bribery Commission and other state mechanisms to curb it. Now, in a country like Sri Lanka, how does one go about ensuring that the public service is strong despite whatever political mockery there may be? Because in other countries we see, a president or a prime minister can leave or resign. It doesn't really matter. The systems continue. The country moves along smoothly. But in Sri Lanka, it's a bit different. So how do you view this?
Yes, that is very interesting area where, even East Asian development, we say that the high quality civil servant played a crucial role in the East Asian development. How the Japan developed, how the Korea developed, the civil servants played a crucial role. In this country, of course, the public sector, even if you take, we have 1.4 million public sector employees.
Right.
But out of that, you see how many percentage of really educated people. because if I say that, because the mass scale, the public sector recruitment has been going through the ministers or the parliamentary members through this recruitment process. So that is one of. And the other thing that even the public sector, some servants, you can see whether they have literacy. That is not only public sector, even for this country, I think as Professor Hettige correctly pointed out, education is the point we can change even the public sector. Because the literacy rate, so for example, we call Sri Lanka has 93% of literacy. Do we have literacy? Because literacy definition is different today. The literacy means today 5 things. One is, of course, the how many languages you can speak. How many languages you can use in the communication process. But in Sri Lanka, you know, even schools, there are 10,000 schools. Out of these 10,000 schools, we run 6,000 schools by only Sinhala medium today. Even 3,000 schools we run only by Tamil medium. Only less than 1,000 schools running with the Tamil and Sinhala or English and Sinhala. So the first condition of literacy is violating. The second is, of course, the most important thing, ICT. Third one is the financial literacy, which is even for a public servants, do we have a financial literacy? Where this country has a serious problem of financial literacy. I always emphasize, because even if you take any average family, what is their hope? That they say for their kids, go to a best school, a good school, and be a first in the class, go to university, you will get a job. So where the job is given by the public sector.